Welcome to the Soul Archaeology podcast, a space for connection, resonance, witnessing, and learning. Together we'll harvest medicine from the spiral of life, sharing conversations with other embodied humans who have navigated their own initiations and found alignment with their true soul essence. With weekly astrology, energy updates, embodied conversation, and channeled teachings, this is a space for you to land and find resonance with the spiral of your own soul. Hello, welcome back to Soul Archaeology. I have a special bonus episode this week for you with Kristen Urlacher, who is a consultant, teacher, writer, and practitioner of Esoteric Mystery Traditions. She has been on the podcast before talking about earth magic, and we are making our way through the different elements to talk about and dive into the well of wisdom that she has access to. This episode is so fun and we really go deep. We both have some significant Scorpio placements, Pluto placements. We're both Libras, so anytime we get together, it can be a very deep, winding, very expansive conversation. So I'm excited for you to listen to this. I just wanted to let you know that I do have, before we begin, I just wanted to touch on a few things, a few announcements. I have one spot available for private mentorship this summer. This is a very deep, very intimate container where we really work together to access your core layers. Any areas where there's stagnation, where you feel blocked, past traumas, the things that are coming to the surface so that you can feel more connected to yourself, more connected to your wisdom, more connected to your power. I blend all of the different modalities I'm trained in within this container. It's my most in-depth and intimate container, and it will be shifting this fall. So this is the last opportunity really to get it at this structure, at this price. If you have any questions or if you'd like to set up a clarity call, you can find the link for that in my show notes. I am also hosting a full moon in Capricorn workshop on July 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific. This will be via Zoom, so you can access it all over the world, wherever you are. It will also be recorded if you cannot make the live. A lot of people end up doing that because life can be busy, and especially on the weekends, but I wanted to make sure it was as close to this full moon as possible. This full moon's pretty powerful and potent. It's the second of the season. So we have the second full moon in Capricorn this Cancer season, and as I described in the last episode of Soul Archaeology, it's a closing and a clearing. I love doing these workshops. They're very in-depth. They're very powerful. The healing is very potent. So if you've joined me before, I'd love to see you again. If you are new, this is a great way to access some really powerful, deep energy work. We do some shamanic journeying. We do some quantum work, a very in-depth energy report. If you're feeling things surface during this time, this is a great way to drop in and receive some support. You can access both of those offerings via my website or in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this episode with Kristen. Hello, Kristen. Welcome back to Soul Archaeology.
Hello, thank you for having me back. How are you?
I'm great. It was before we hopped on and started recording, we were kind of going into a whole our scorpionic journey into the unseen, and it was so fun. And then we're like, okay, we have to get back on track here.
Gotta focus. We gotta focus. We like to go
exactly.
deep.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited to begin our studies of air magic.
Yes, we had decided on covering the 4 elements. In our last conversation, we decided to, under the beautiful Taurus Earth stellium, we decided to start with the element of Earth and talk about the relationship between Earth in terms of its energetic embodiment, but also how to apply it in practice when we're thinking about the esoteric and magical practice, and developing that relationship between, you know, what is material, what is earth, but also the spirits that are attached to those material places in terms of our locations and our nature practices, and starting to think about things in a more abstract way to where we can then tie into the spirits that dwell in those locations. Because ultimately, with this practice of magic in a form of self-development, it is all about the connection to the divine and how we facilitate that through these elemental practices and through these magical practice, because the divine wants to communicate with us, the divine wants to wake us up to it, and that is ultimately the goal, is to enliven our relationship to these various elements, and in order to better understand ourselves and better understand this very large organism that we live in.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. And it was so cool to take, really, we recorded that episode and then I went to Yosemite. It was like the next day. So, and it was really amazing, because I feel like since we recorded that, I received such a beautiful opening and activation through that learning, and have found the land communicating to me, you know, through different people, through different opportunities. I have a dear friend here, Eve Gaines, who has a beautiful property that she is a steward of. And she invited me to commune with mugwort, which was such an incredible process, and really just honoring this Chumash tradition of laying on a bed of mugwort and allowing that to be such an incredibly grounding and nourishing practice. And so we did that. And then I took mugwort home and I was sitting with it in tea. And I received exactly what I needed to. I received the message that I need to slow down, that I need to self-nourish and deepen into my self-care practices, that I need to open to receive more, you know? And then even I was back in St. Louis a few weeks later and connected with that land, my homeland, in a way that I had never done before. And, you know, there's so many different, I won't go into all the details, but just these incredible, beautiful messengers. This woman, Meg, who owns a property there that's a shrine to Mother Mary, which is interesting because in that episode, we talked about my devotional practice to Mother Mary. So it was interesting that she came through. Right into
it.
Yep. And that just it feels like something clicked in for me, connected to the land where I was born, because I have such an interesting, sometimes challenging relationship with that land, with it being my Pluto line. And it was just lovely how it opened to me in that way. So I'm excited to hear how others have experienced that.
For sure. No, it's and when I lived in California, I worked with mugwort a lot because it was so plentiful there. And mugwort is one of those plants that grows, if you have any of the natural streams. I used to go up to Switzer, which is up in the Angeles Forest, and I would gather mugwort along the little, very small stream that's up there. I'm not sure if it's pronounced Schweitzer or Switzer, but it is Switzer. And but the mugwort is a very powerful feminine plant to work with. And when you begin to ingest her and sleep with her, like how you were lying, the tradition of lying on a bed of mugwort, it is a highly, highly communicative plant. So that's the beginning of developing these relationships with these plants, is to engage with them, interact with them, ingest them on some level, and they will begin to communicate to you, which is a part of this practice. And it leads us into the element of air, because this is much of the nature of this element. Not much, but it's almost all of the nature of this element is various forms of communication. So when we are looking to communicate to these spirits of the land, spirits of the plants, spirits of the divine, spirits of the cosmos, it's like you're having to do it through your capacity and your connection to the element of air. So I love how it just kind of segues in. It's like developing those communications and how that leads us into this place of learning how, or helping, inspiring people to develop their own abilities to communicate to these very sentient beings.
Yeah, it's having that experience with Mother Mary in St. Louis, and then coming home and realizing that I really wanted to return to my prayer practice to her in particular has been so orienting for me. And and knowing mugwort being a feminine plant and that nourishment and the mother archetype, it's something I'm just in so much right now. Of course, it's Cancer season 2 when we're recording this, but it's that just is interesting because it brought me into my prayer practice in a deeper way. So
no, that's exactly how the spirits work, is they want to link us into these things. They're trying to communicate, and they can't communicate to us in the forms that humans are apt at communicating. So therefore, we have to learn how to tap into our other frequencies and our other sensitivities and our because we have the ability, we have these functions within us. It's like we have to awaken them, but that's how they will link us back into certain relationships and forms of communication. It all starts with mugwort, and it leads you to Mary, and then it leads you to water, and then it leads you to the river up in St. Louis, and then it leads you back into a prayer practice, and it's all connected. It all started with that mugwort talking to you.
so cool. I love it so much. It's all interconnected, and that's what I find so much peace within, is that there's just all of the elements are connected, all of these archetypes are connected, that it really returns to that one space,
Yeah.
It's very comforting.
And they'll just constantly lead you, they'll always be leading you through things. And it's a very serpent-like nature to this work, as it sort of snakes in and out in a way, and it's very quiet and subtle, but you'll find how it leads you into places, and then it'll circle you back, and then you'll make that connection. But it's very snake-like in nature. It's not a smooth, linear movement. It's not I'm going to do this and then I'm going to receive that. It doesn't work that way. It's very curved and it's very subtle. But once you tap into it, it becomes clearer and clearer, and it actually starts happening in a more rapid pace. And then things just start falling into place. But it's all in that initial stages of practice and trust and devotion, and allowing, just paying attention too, just allowing things to unfold in front of you, but paying attention to the cues and the clues and the signs. And you'll find that these spirits are speaking very, very clearly to us all of the time. It's actually profound. It's actually very profound.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's really about that presence, and the listening and the creation of space, altar, to have space to truly listen. So
yeah. And it's devotion. Like, you have to be devoted to the work. It's like a lot of people have an interest in this work, or they're curious about it, but you really do need to commit to the work on a level, to give it time to link itself into you. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, actually, because when I first started sitting with this conversation of air, it was so big. It was such big, it was uncontained, which is funny because air is uncontainable. Like, it is just so vast, and it's hard to place boundaries around the element of air. So it's, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that it took me a while to organize how I wanted to, where to begin with this conversation, and how to create some useful, practical, but also inspirational practices that people can take home and chew on and instill in their own personal work. So it lends us to examining the 4 elements through tools, because tools are tangible. And so it's sort of a foundational place to begin, is to think about the elements in practice through a physical object. And so most people will maybe understand or hear or know that the elements correspond with certain things, like the element of earth corresponds with the pentacle or the pentagram. Some people view it as a dark occult symbol, but really it's just a 5-pointed star. And that pentagram or pentacle corresponds with the element of earth, because the pentagram is basically Venus's pattern, her synodic cycle, her positioning to the sun in the sky. It is a 5-petaled star, 5-petaled flower that Venus creates in terms of her orbit around the sun. So that's where that shape and that pattern came from, is Venus's relationship in the cosmos. And Venus governs the earth sign of Taurus, and Venus rules matters of fertility and creation and procreation. So you start to see these corresponding links, but it starts with that element of the pentacle. And then we have the tool of the sword, and sword corresponds with the air, corresponds with the mind, how we use the sword to cut through the veil of illusion, use the sword to cut through the veil of ignorance, and how we're supposed to be constantly clarifying our minds in order to see what is the truth in our reality. We live in a reality that actively tries to deceive us. And this is not just the nature of, external forces at play. We also deceive ourselves when we think about the nature of delusion or self-deception. There's a lot of things that can deceive us. So part of learning how to exercise your sword is learning how to cut through the deception, whether it's coming from an external source or whether it's coming from within yourself. So you could always find that center ground, that center space of what is called the truth or the inherent knowing. In terms of the other tools, we also have the chalice or the cup, which corresponds with the element of water. And the nature of the cup is the well. It's the receptive thing that you can pour things into, and it holds things in place, but it only receives. So when we think about our emotional sphere, when we think about the power of influence, it's all chalice or cup, cup correspondences. And this corresponds with the nature of water, the element of water. This corresponds with the mother, the nature of, we think about the zodiacal sign of Cancer. We think about the moon ruling Cancer. This is cup energy. And then we also have the wand, which is all about our passions and our desires and our will. So there's this kind of 4 individualized things or entities, tools, so to speak, but they all merge together as a family. So we want to think about the cup, the water as the mother, the moon. We think about the sword as the father, air, the intellect, the sun. And then we have earth, the pentacle, Venus, which is the daughter. And then we have the sun, which is the element of fire and is the wand. So these are the dynamics of masculine, feminine, of hierarchy versus the father and the son. And then we also have the nature of the 4 elements working together, which creates the mind, the body, the spirit, and everything that makes us who we are as humans. So we all have these 4 elements inside of us. And the key to the work is to learn how to work with these 4 elements in a way that we can get them to all be cohesive in accordance to our awareness, in accordance to our consciousness. The goal is to elevate our consciousness to them and to integrate them and to get them to work as a whole. So it's this integration process that is the work of this, what is ultimately self-development.
Yeah, I love that. And it's really, it's when you think about it, it's important. Each and every piece and part is important,
Mhm.
and it all plays into something we need as the whole, so it's like at certain times you might need to create a practice more in devotion to one of the energies to develop that certain aspect of yourself or to strengthen it. And depending on even your birth chart too, right? There's like,
Absolutely.
yeah, but the end
The
of the
map.
day,
Yeah, that's the map that the birth chart gives, you know, it
yeah,
shows you where these planets fall inside of these elemental energies. And that's what gives us a map of our own understanding. But it's not who we are. I emphasize this a lot in my own personal practice and with my clients. It's like your birth chart is not who you are per se. It is the hand you were dealt, but you're going to have to learn how to navigate it. And you're ultimately learning how to, you know, enliven certain parts that maybe are a little sluggish. You know, if you don't have planets in certain elements, I don't have earth, I have very little fire. So I have to actively work towards cultivating those energies within myself, or neutralizing some excess. You know, it's like, it just gives us the roadmap. It's the formula. You know, it's like when we think about alchemical principles and what alchemy is, it's all about creating formulas, mixing two things and creating a third thing. And all of that is a form of experimentation, but at the same time, they're trying to create gold, right? That's the goal with alchemy, is to take lead and turn it into a semi-precious metal, which is silver or gold. And it's funny because I think about that in terms of astrology, and it's like lead is governed by Saturn. Lead is the limiter. Lead is the dense and the most densest material form of the construct of our beings and the construct of our reality. And then we have these luminaries, the sun and the moon, which governs these semi-precious metals, silver and gold, and how we're taking Saturn and we're taking the sun and we're trying to alchemize the two. You know what I mean? We're trying to go from Saturn into the sun. So we are trying to pull ourselves out of the limitations of Saturn, and we're trying to elevate our consciousness in a way that helps us step into those higher forms of being.
And also the importance of the lead and the importance of Saturn to understand ourselves better, you know, and to understand where we are and how we can work with that to, you know, elevate to a higher consciousness.
Well, we're in it. Like,
Yeah.
this is Saturn. Like, the material realm is Saturn's landscape. I mean, he governs, and that's why we're limited to it. You know, we can't just, well, I mean, maybe some people can. I can't yet. You know, hopefully you can ascend into those things. But I mean, you're in your physical body. You can't, like, you know, you can't transcend the physical body until you ultimately die, you know, and
Right.
you can't transcend the material realm until you elevate your consciousness into a way that you can transcend into heaven. Or it's just these concepts of limitation. And part of that is to learn that you have to accept the limitation in order to overcome it in any way, shape, or form. So Saturn is always there, and Saturn is a useful tool, and lead is a useful tool, even though it's, you know, highly toxic and poisonous. But it's like the concept of that weight and that connection to the earth and that connection to the material realm and the importance of it. But at the same time, what people are trying to do, or people who are trying to achieve higher states of being, is they're trying to elevate themselves into the higher forms, and they're trying to separate themselves from the nature of the lead or the nature of Saturn.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is essentially bypassing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which doesn't really work.
It doesn't. But at the same time, you got to learn, because it introduces that whole alchemical philosophy of, is you got to work with both.
Yes.
You got to work with both, because the way out is that middle path.
Yeah.
You know?
And I feel that.
Yeah, if you're going too far on the light, then you're not necessarily on the that center path. It's all about the scales, you know, the nature of the scales. You got to have both, and there's something in the middle that's the conduit that you're actually going to aspire to tap into.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to tend to the physical as we go through these waves of expansion of consciousness, and really see it as a beautiful vessel for transcendence, you know?
Well, you know, it's like when I was sitting with this conversation in my mind, I was thinking, like, what do we need to do to help activate more understanding within ourselves of how to work with these elements? And that's one thing that I see a lot of people doing, which is always seeking outside of themselves. So they're seeking these experiences through, different journeying with plant medicines. They're seeking these experiences through, escaping into the wilderness. They're seeking these experiences, through very external sources. But what's interesting is that I find from my personal experience, but also just through written texts on this information, that the key to learning how to work with these 4 elements and these tools and to achieve these ultimate states of being is by sitting and being with yourself in forms of meditation. And this kind of introduces, not kind of, but it does introduce the nature of air, or the beginning, the introduction of air in terms of practice. And this is through the art and the importance of meditation. So in order to learn about yourself, you're going to have to sit with yourself. And in order to learn how to connect with the divine, you're going to have to sit and quiet yourself in order to hear the external sources coming through. This all happens within inside yourself. You're not going to find it through a plant journey or through, immense, spirit seeking quests or adventures. A lot of people are kind of seeking through the act of adventure, and that's great, but you want to think about the kind of stimulation that's involved and how that actually separates you from the practice of just being with yourself in solitude, in a space that you feel comfortable and you can get really quiet. So yeah, the act of meditation is where I encourage my practice, my clients to begin with. And how, when we think about the Latin term of solve and coagula, which you see in a lot of esoteric texts, you'll sometimes see it written with the Ouroboros around it. You'll see it on the image of Baphomet, which is a deity of all things mashed into one whole. And it's this idea that in Latin, it is the alchemical principle of dissolving and then bringing things together. So when we think about that in a meditation practice, and when we think about that in terms of our astrology or in terms of these elemental tools, you have to learn how to sit and distinguish between your cup, your emotional body, your sword, your intellectual body, your pentacle, your physical material body, and your wand, which is your desires, your what you want. And you have to learn how to dissolve those things in a way that you can separate and distinguish them. And then you learn how to coagulate, pull them back in, and get them to work as an integrated union. So this is what being whole is. And this is what making the unconscious conscious is. It's that idea of, you got to get to know these parts of yourself, and you got to learn how to feel the physical body, and you got to learn how to feel your stomach and feel your organs. These are what practices like yoga and breath work and just sitting and meditating do. And then learning how to tap into your sword, which is your reason, your logic, and then tapping into your emotional sphere, tapping into your desires, and creating a deep understanding of all those parts of yourself. You know what I mean? Like really getting to know yourself. I mean, the number one thing written when you read any type of occult material is to know thyself. And this is the practice. And you only can do it clear, clean, and in solitude, or in practice through meditation. You have to be you have to be a bit disciplined with it to really kind of hone in on how to do that effectively and to not be influenced by external sources.
Yeah. I mean, that makes so much sense. And oftentimes when people ask where to begin, I always say, create space.
Yes.
Just create space to be alone, to be in your own energy field, to actually get to know what those different bodies are saying, how they speak, how they come through.
Yes.
Because otherwise, when we're in life and we're always around other people, we're getting data and information from their field. We're taking things on that aren't ours. We are interpreting it as ours, you know?
Yes.
So it's not until we can get really quiet that we start to hear our own messages, you know?
Exactly.
And to be able to know what's happening in our mind, to be able to know what's happening in our bodies, our emotional body, like you said, and our desires too. So it's that space is so important.
Yes. Well, and two, it's like when we think about the nature of Mercury, you know, from an astrological standpoint, Mercury governs the mind. Mercury governs the ability to connect not only with others in terms of humans, but also our ability to connect with the divine, our ability to connect with our own consciousness. It's, you know, Mercury is this entity that does, he wears lots of hats. This is why he's associated with a messenger god with wings. And also I say he, but the nature of Mercury is actually both genders, or both sexes, I should say, not genders, sexes, because he's both masculine and feminine. I say he out of habit, but it's just more of it's why that planet is both things, because it's got to govern the water, it's got to govern the earth, it's got to interpret the sword, it's got to interpret the fire, to help us understand those things. So when you think about the nature of our Mercury juggling all of these balls, you know, that's kind of how you want to view it, is Mercury's juggling. You have to learn how to discern and distinguish, because otherwise they are constantly canceling each other out. They are overriding each other. If you have strong water, that means your emotions are going to override your logic and your reason. If you've got too much air, that means your logic and rationale are going to override your instincts and your intuition. You know, this is why people struggle with tapping into concepts like channeling or divination, or just connecting with divine voice or divine spirit, because chances are they have an element that's overriding their ability to do so. So this is the nature of the work, is to understand that your Mercury is governing all of these things and helping communicate this to you. And we have to then work really hard to clarify our Mercury and properly support our Mercury to where it's not getting infiltrated or overloaded with, you know, too much of one thing, or too much influence coming in from external sources, too much noise. And this is really the nature of our material realm right now. Like when we think about the hyper distractive busyness that's take place, I mean, I don't even need to preach that. Everyone just knows that. Phones and advertising and technology, it's like that's all influence, and that's all designed to distract you. So you get further and further away from yourself, and you get further and further away from your own Mercury, and your Mercury gets clogged up. And therefore you're no longer in a state of conscious being, you are in a state of unconscious being. People talk a lot about the unconscious way of being and how most of what we're doing is unconscious. The goal is to become conscious of our unconscious.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is the work, and it all comes through helping exercise our Mercury, giving it support and protection. The protection of the Mercury is important as well.
Yeah. So would you suggest that people protect and support their Mercury through taking time alone, shutting down devices, cleansing, meditation?
Yeah. All of those things. We had talked before, it's like, and I had spoken about it elsewhere. It's like you see in a lot of spiritual practices or orthodox practices where people are covering their crown, you know, and this is where our little antenna resides, our mercurial antenna. And there is something to be said for covering the head in order to protect oneself from influence and from, you know, the crown being influenced or infiltrated by external sources that either you are aware of or unconscious of. When you're walking down the street, especially when you're in a busy city or in a busy place with lots of stimulus, it's like, even if you aren't consciously paying attention to something, that stimulus is still working its way in. So learning how to protect the crown is a very important and very powerful way to protect your Mercury. And when you think about the crown chakra, its correspondence to the moon, the intuition. Once again, imagine the cup or the chalice, how that Mercury sits in a cup that can just be poured into. So that's where the influence enters our beings, is through that crown space, because that's the cup up there. That's where our cup resides, and how it pours into our emotional body. So we get all of these stimulus, is that a word? The stimuli, there you go, the stimuli that we then have to clarify and separate and dissolve and do all that work around, in order to really dig into if it is something that we want for ourselves consciously, that we're consciously connecting with it and not doing something unconsciously. And we'll get that through just impulsions. Like if you've ever been out and you just shopping impulsively or talking impulsively, it's all because you've gotten some stimulus that you're not conscious of.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it's true. I mean, in the practice of really developing and connecting to your intuition, that alone time is so important to get in touch with what does a yes feel like? How does that voice come through? How does it speak to you? Where do you feel it in your body? And to discern what is that and what is fear? What is a program? What is conditioning or something coming in from someone else rather than your own truth channel,
No, exactly. I mean, you have to sit with it, and you have to learn how to be really clear with yourself and clear in your body. And this is why so many people begin practices by eliminating certain things, certain foods, certain, heavy metals from the diets. It's like eliminating certain substances that we ingest, in a way of helping create clarity, because being clear is an important part of the work. So it's like, if you're ingesting a lot of substances or chemicals or intoxicants, it's very difficult for the body to connect with the mind and therefore allow these channels to open up. So I encourage people to consider being very clear, at least for a period of time, through these exercises, in order to start to really sit with, what is being communicated, but also to at least allow themselves that the beginning of separation, of the dissolve, separating things, separating, in order to then understand them and bring them back together.
Yeah. Would you say that, I mean, we're in a Saturn retrograde period until November. Is this a good time to choose
I like
to do?
that.
I
Yeah.
do too. Yeah.
I like
think
that.
that
It's
it
like
might
a good
be
reflection. Well, and plus with Saturn and Pisces and just what the nature of
Oh.
Pisces is, it's like, it's all about these the more abstract ways of thinking and being and higher states of consciousness. So yeah, I'm into it. That's a perfect connection.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that's such a Saturnian sort of the discipline that comes with detoxing and with giving things up and with,
Yes.
discerning. And I even, encourage, for me, when I had my real big awakening moment, it was so rattling for me that I had no choice. I had to go through these detoxes in different ways. I had to really go inward. I had to cut out certain people from my, not, super aggressively, but I had to start spending more time alone, to really hear that voice and to start rewiring some of the patterning, like the default patternings that we all have,
For sure.
because these bodies start communicating and then we default to that,
Totally. And I love that you brought up people, because it's like people can be influences that are not supportive of these practices. And it's hard for me to say that out loud, because I don't want to sound hurtful against people at all, but it's like, you really do have to assess who you're surrounding yourself with and the influences that how they impact your life. And you do have to become more discerning of what you allow in terms of those types of interactions. And because it's important for your own wellness, and it's important for your own practice, in order to step into these higher ways of being, these kind of goals in terms of our development as humans. And sometimes it requires us creating a lot of boundaries or separation against people who interfere with that process or interfere with that work.
Yeah. And it's so true, because everyone around us is used to us being a certain way and showing up a certain way, right? And it's like that saying that the people that benefit from you having no boundaries are the ones that respond so negatively when you start setting them, you know? It's very revealing. Just like a detox is revealing. It's like, oh yeah, detoxing specific everything you're ingesting, essentially, you know, kind of taking audit and like, how is this serving? What is my intention with using this? Is it a way to escape? And like we talked about this before we started recording, the different, very subtle ways that we dissociate and escape from reality, you know, and how being totally sober in many different ways is so beneficial.
I feel like it's everything. And I love Saturn in Pisces for this I feel like it's since Saturn entered Pisces, you're seeing more and more people choosing no alcohol. I'm just seeing more like headlines about it or more like articles about it. I came across an article that I guess I'm never good. I ingest a lot of like written material, but I'm never good about connecting it to the source. So I apologize. But it was a written article about how vineyards and wineries are struggling right now because the younger generation they're not drinking wine, and how more and more people are getting sober and they're not partaking on alcohol at the same degree that was once very fashionable, and how it's having this direct impact on alcohol industry as a whole. So it's interesting what the future holds for the nature of alcohol. And but I love Saturn and Pisces for this, because that is very Saturn and very Pisces, you know, having this stoic, stern, leaden, cold, you know, disciplinary figure inside of abstract, very high, very, you know, free and very escapist nature of Pisces. It's just so literal.
Yeah, and it's really doing a number on us collectively. It's just like really, really revealing these ways that we live in illusion, you know? And
it's interesting because now we're dealing with technology, which is creating a whole other veil of illusion. It's almost like, you know, as soon as we start to clarify one, another one rolls right in.
So true.
It's like all of a sudden they're like, well, we got to unleash the AI now because they're getting too clear and clean. What can we infiltrate next? Like it's a constant battle. Like as a person and you can relate, like a person who's trying to stay in that clarity and in that conscious way of being, how it's just, you're constantly battling it because they're just rolling it out on you. All of the misinformation and all of the, I don't know, just all of it. All of it. I don't even like to bring it up because I'm just seeing noise inside of my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it can be its own distraction too, you know?
It's the news and politics and everything that's going on right now is what we're referring to. But it's just that sense of how it is a definite form of distraction and illusion and deception. Deception, guys, is a big word. Deception. A lot of deception going on.
Yeah. And we know, like, the more distraction, the more noise that is created, the less we're able to hear that truth channel, you know? But I always feel like it's like Jedi. It's Jedi training. It's like I remember a shaman was talking about it one time where, you know, of course, like you kind of like start out meditating alone in total silence, and then you move into this space of meditating in a huge arena at a concert, you know? And it's like training the mind and training all the different bodies to work together so that you can be present with life and be in a group of people and still be connected to yourself in that way, you know?
Exactly. Like that is the work. That's the foundation of the work. It all has to start with these practices that are very much about connecting to your mind, connecting to your body, discerning these elements, sitting in quiet. Because I think a lot of people have maybe a misunderstanding of meditation, that they think it's all about being quiet. And it's not necessarily about maintaining quietness, is what it is, at least from my practice. It's about learning how to get quiet so you can begin to hear and begin to channel and begin to connect. And this leads me into just something that's interesting that I came across in my own meditation of preparing for this, which was how I sat with the word truth. Like, what is truth? Like, when you think about what truth is, how your sword represents truth, and how staying true to yourself and staying true to who you are is a part of this practice. And how do we define what truth is, especially when we live in such a reality where it's all deception? Even the conditioning that we received from early childhood through our parents, all of that was a form of deception too, because it was so much of it was projection. Like, we just were cultivated and grown in these gardens of just total non-truth, and how this work is all about finding that inherent core inside of your being that you can correspond to your sword, which is finding that middle pillar, or that nature of what being true is. And it made me sit with the word knowing. Like, how do you know when something is true or not? And the word knowing, like, I love to look down the rabbit hole of the origins of words, and like the etymology of knowing or to know is the word to recognize, which is interesting, right? Because it's like, to recognize something implies that it's familiar.
Yeah.
And so it's like connecting to what is familiar helps you connect to what you know, implies that we already know the truth, that we have the truth inside of us, and that it will reveal itself through a sense of recognition, which means it's going to feel or be or impact us in a way that our sensories identify as familiar. And when you take it into that, when you take that word familiar into a deeper context, it's like, in terms of magical and occult practices, there is the term familiar spirit. And familiar spirits are these individual forms of intelligence or spirit beings that we have that communicate with us. And sometimes people develop relationships with these familiar spirits through their land and the land spirits in which they reside, through their animals, through forms of meditation, to where it's sort of like a holy guardian spirit or the holy daimon. It's like connecting with this sentience that is outside of ourselves, but it's exclusively ours. It has a relationship with us. And how this is what the practice of gnosis is, because gnosis, of course, is the Greek word for the ancient Greek word of knowledge. So it circles us back to that word of knowing and knowledge, gnosis, and how it's connected to this practice of communicating with these divine familiar spirits that ultimately give us information. So when you study the concepts of familiars, they are giving you knowledge. And you see this in practice through various ancient, documentations. Gnosis and familiar spirits are written about in quite a bit in the Bible. Of course, they're telling you to stay away from those familiar spirits, not trust those familiar spirits. But in other practices, it's encouraging you to connect with this spirit, because that is your sentient being. That is it's your guide. It's your guide. It is your, I don't even know what to call it. It is your higher self. It is your sentience that is helping you hone that sword and helping you recognize what is true.
Yeah.
You know what I
That's
mean?
amazing. Yeah, totally. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because when I'm working with clients, or, they're seeking to connect more with their intuition, or they're kind of going into psychic development or, channeling practices, when they land within that space and they start to hear that voice and hear that, they're like, oh, this, it's like, oh, that's so familiar. I feel like I've always known that. I feel like that's always been there.
Familiar. Yes.
Yeah. So I love that you connected that.
So it's like, that's really what the practice of meditation is for you to learn how to connect with your familiar or the familiars. You can have multiple, and those familiars will communicate with you. And this is really what the act of divination is. So much of this practice, is learning how to connect with yourself, discern between your elements to make sure that you have your your emotions clarified, your logic clarified, your physical body clarified, and your passions and desires clarified and controlled. And then you can open up this channel to connect with these external sentiences that are communicating to you. So you will begin to hear, at least that's how that's how I receive the messages. I can hear it. Like it sounds like, thoughts, inspirations that come in, but it actually sounds like a message to me, and I'll channel it through writing. And it's through the practice of that, I end up filling journals where I have a whole dialogue where I will ask questions and I will write them. And then I will channel the response. I use cards and astrology to divine these responses, and I'll channel it back to myself. And you can see the whole dialogue taking place. And what's weird is when you reflect back on it, I don't know if you journal or not, but if you reflect back on it, it definitely is not you. Like it's a different consciousness. And that's what's so wild about it. And then you can take that practice and elevate it and take it to your landscape, take it to your river, and begin to communicate with that and divine with that intelligence. And then you can do it with your animals, and you can do it with, you can take that technique, it's a tool, and you can plug it into multiple things and develop these channels of communications with these familiar spirits.
That's a great point, is channeled writing, is that such a great way to connect and to get messages, and just being open to, the familiar message that's coming through.
And it allows you to create, once again, that kind of separation. Because I think that when people start this work and they're still kind of muddied on the inside, because everyone's muddied when they first come to this work, they haven't created clarity in order to understand all the parts of themselves yet. And you have to do that constantly, no matter what. So that's not something that you get done. It's a constant practice, but it allows you to reflect back on what you channeled and wrote. And sometimes things will come out at you that you didn't recognize then, but that a year later, when you're reflecting back on it, it impacts you in a way that it's like, oh, wow, like that's really manifested in this way, or that did this thing. Like it's amazing how it opens up all these doors and opens up all these thoughts and inspirations of what these communications actually give you, which is all types of divine thoughts, ideas, things to try. When we think about what the imagination is, when we think about inspiration, how it comes to us, we think that that's just all ours, but is it? Is it ours? If you're an artist, if you're a painter, if you are an engineer, and you get this idea that no one's done before, or at least no one on your radar has done before, it's like, where did that come from? Is it yours, or did somebody drop it in?
I know. I love thinking about that. I think that when you look at some of the artists, and like music artists, for example, or, portrait artists, not even portraits, but just, different type of artists, essentially. It's amazing what they were able to create given the times. And even like architecture, we were kind of talking about that earlier. Where was this coming from? It had to be coming from something divine, something higher, a higher consciousness. And so I sometimes think, like Matt and I kind of talk about this because he's an artist, that it's channeling, we're channeling creative energy. And so if it doesn't come through you, it will come through someone else.
Yes.
And as I know, there are a lot of creatives that listen to this. And so really getting so in tune with your own channel, detoxing from the noise, from all the programs, all the opinions, all of the things, right? Even like physically as well. It's so important. And then I've had clients who are writers, we really work on clearing their channel so that they can pull it in more efficiently and feel it more deeply, you know? So it's so cool to see how that, I love that you mentioned that, because
it's just like, also too, it's like the act of creating, you know, when we think about the actual physical act of it, how it encourages its own form of meditative practice. And so if you pay attention to your inner voice that's channeling and communicating while you're actually doing something, I think most of us find that to be noise, unconscious noise. And so they're just sort of like letting it run in their mind and they're not giving it much attention. But just to pay attention to what comes up in the messaging while you're doing those acts, and how one act will invoke a certain channel and another act will invoke a different channel. And it allows you to really, again, distinguish and create distinction between these things. I encouraged somebody to do 100 push-ups. And then I had to do 100 push-ups to match their 100 push-ups, because I'm like, I'm not going to tell people to do something and I won't do it myself. I can't do 100 push-ups. I have to break it up throughout. It took me like 2.5 days to do my 100 push-ups. But it's like paying attention to the noise, what comes up when you're doing 100 push-ups, because push-ups are really hard. They're hard for me. And you get a lot of internal resistance. And it's like the energy of what your body is doing, it's pushing something, you're like pushing away from something, how it brings up thoughts and messages that are going to connect and correspond to that action, if that makes sense. And to really pay attention to what comes up and to write it down and journal it. And you will learn how to cultivate a lot of awareness around these various messages and how these actions, because in magic and ritual, it is all action. So you're doing an active thing in order to project your will. It's like you learn how to pay attention to these voices, and then these voices become tools. Like you can harness them, you can kind of get understanding of them, and it becomes that sense of external divine presence that's around you all the time. But they're all different. There are more than one.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So how do you discern between something that's of a higher consciousness and fear, for example, you know?
That is very hard for me. And I will say, because I have a Saturn in Cancer, and my Saturn in Cancer loves to be worry. Like worry. Like, let's worry about it. If we can't control it, we're just going to worry. I find that my practice actually helps me navigate worry and fear. And because I'm actually one of those people, because I have so much water in my chart, and my ruling planet is in Scorpio. So it's in that depth all the time. So I'm always thinking about things from the lowest point, which is where the darkest of the dark can be. So I have to cultivate a lot of practice around that. But again, it is learning how to be clear, and it is my meditative practice, because what is true will not budge. What is fear will ebb and flow. It'll come in and it'll go out, as with all emotional spirit or all emotional themes. So that's, at least from my practice and perspective, that's how I discern between the two. Like, if it is true, it will always, it'll be there. And if it's not, it's going to come and go. It'll, be intense one night, and then it'll go away the next day, and then might come back in. But that's how I distinguish it. I kind of think of it in terms of the current of water or the current of ocean, of coming in, the tides are in, and now the tides are out. And that's when I know that something is not in that firm, solid space of being true. How do you distinguish?
Yeah, very similarly. I think it's this around the same concept, but I always think that fear oftentimes has a sense of urgency. It like wants something completed really quickly, or you're running out of time, or there's like a push to it. You know what I mean? It almost has this like push and
panic,
exactly. And intuition and higher consciousness, whatever it is that you're channeling, is pretty solid. Like it feels like a pillar in a way. Like energetically to me, it feels like a pillar of light. Like it's just like, okay, this is present, this is here, I can choose to listen to it, I can choose it, but it's not going to it's not going to force me into anything. It's not going to create any panic to follow it. You know what I mean?
For sure. And, it's like leaning into my personal, like, and this is what prayer is all about. It's like to help you ground and to connect with the divine source that will help calm your waters, because when your waters get ruffled and when because fear really is the poison. I mean, that's why fear mongering is so effective in terms of controlling populations. It's like, it is one of the most effective ways of getting people to react in a way that is impulsive and panic driven and not completely disengaging their reason and their logic and their rational thinking. So yeah, and it really does come down with sitting, being quiet, being in practice. And for me, I get so much from my veneration, from the prayers that I write and memorize and recite, and mantras. I find mantras to be super effective to put yourself into a state of being that if you're running hot or high, that's how I perceive it. Like if I'm fear or I'm worrying about something, it feels very hot and high. It lowers me, puts me down into the ground, down into the earth, but it's the repetitive practice of the mantra that just all of a sudden it just calms, clears. And then again, you can just find yourself in a much more centered state.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad you brought up mantras because I feel like this is an important piece of air magic. And it's the practice of speaking something.
Yes. No, it's everything because it's the power of the word. And when you think about language, like this is why I love personally going down the rabbit hole of the root, the origin of words, because it's so enlightening about languages. And because I've always sat with the concept of like, why were they constantly evolving language and pushing language in a way that pulls people away from their origins or their native tongue, and what kind of power that is and how that is such a form of manipulation. So it's like, I find that like just reflecting on words and studying their etymology and studying their Latin roots, and you will get so much strange, profound insight on why and how they are always, even till this day, actively working towards changing words and language to constantly be throwing wrenches in our ability to communicate. I mean, just recently, and this is in my children's generation, they no longer taught cursive. Were you taught cursive in school?
Yes.
Okay, I was too. My children, my youngest is 26, was not taught cursive. And he's so far away from cursive that he struggles reading cursive writing, it floors me. And it floors me why they weren't teaching it. But if you think about it, like, what is our Constitution written in?
Yeah, cursive.
What does that allow people in power to do?
Yeah, interesting.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is right when you were talking about this, it brought me to 1984, the book 1984, and how language is such a center. Have you read that?
No, I've read Cliff Notes on it, but no,
Okay.
but I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, it would be interesting. I would love to hear I'd love to see your notes on that book. Yeah, it's fascinating, but there's a stripping of language that happens in that world. And it's because language holds so much power. And so they're taking a language essentially, and they're pulling out all of the excess, all of the fluff, like all of the words that we don't need. And it becomes this like coded language that's a representation of this new world that they're creating. And it strips the character and the beauty and the culture and the individualization that comes through language and that comes through writing even.
And it also strips out the truth, because they're able to then what is called translate. Because if we're projecting out into the future, if no one can interpret cursive writing, and only the select few can interpret cursive writing, and very important things like the Constitution of the United States is written in cursive, it allows them to translate it. And I'm putting translated into air quotations. And then that translation can be modified. That translation can be, varied in a way that no one will be able to question it, because that cursive writing is now obsolete. So we've seen this with books. We've seen this with old books, transcripts, and how translation is a huge window of opportunity to change some stuff up if you want, to do a little editing, to do a little modification, So it's interesting to me how these practices are happening up until this day, very recently, with no longer teaching children how to write in cursive or to read cursive, more importantly, and how just that in of itself is going to eliminate the mass population of understanding certain transcripts, documents that are written in a cursive language.
Yeah. And it's interesting because this push to focus on numbers and something like algebra or calculus, now that we have this takeover by computers and AI, even in that realm. So it's like, what are we actually learning and why,
Exactly.
And
well, I love that you brought up that, because we're now giving the power away to the computers, to where we no longer have to really understand these formulas and these very sacred things, because math and numbers are ancient and they're formulas for things. And we're already so far removed from understanding the origins of these things, and how the further we are becoming as a species, as we give all of our mathematics away to the nature of computers, to where we are making ourselves very vulnerable. We're making ourselves very vulnerable in terms of knowing things, in terms of being able to read things, because this is what we do as humans, as creatives, because this is our power, is the power of creation. We create here on planet Earth as humans. We create cities and buildings and businesses and culture and food, and we're building and creating all of these things. And another thing we love to create is written documentation, or a way of capturing, this time and space. What does 2024 look like? Let's write it down. Let's try to document it and uphold, some truth about what this landscape looks like. But if we do it in a way that is not permanent, how that allows for, again, the opportunity for other things to be put into its place. So I think that's why it's so important as artists and as, beings of planet Earth, to think about how you can leave things behind for the future. Even if you're just thinking about your kids, your grandkids, your great grandkids, it's like, what can you leave behind that helps communicate things that they will recognize as familiar? So it's like putting those codes in there. And this is why hidden knowledge is still here. It's why, because they learned how to hide it, because they knew they had to hide it, because otherwise it would be infiltrated. So this is why you learn to trust nature, because nature holds these codes. This is why you learn to trust the cosmos and the sky, because they hold these codes, and is why you learn how to cultivate a relationship with yourself, because your blood, your ancestral DNA, your inner familiars, they all know these codes. So this is it.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. It's wild, because it's like we are unlearning some languages, and learning the ancient languages of the universe, and of the earth.
The nature will never lie to you. That's the key. It's nature reveals itself very clearly, and it'll never lie. It'll never mislead you. It just is what it is. And again, it's like when we think about the nature of our blood, which is connected to the element of water, which comes through our matrilineal lineage, it's like we all come from mothers, and it's the mother's blood that, becomes our blood, and how that's carried through all of the maternal lines. It makes a lot of sense of why they would want to cut off people from the the matrilineal or the matriarchal lineage. It's like why women were, cut off from their last names, and why the origins of just the mother, it's like so fragmented, but it's much easier to connect yourself through the father because everyone's names were changed. Again, it connects back to language, what is written, what is documented. It's like how that is such a form of manipulation to prevent you from knowing who you are. Because your mother, that lineage all the way back, is going to take you to an origin story, the true origin story.
Yes.
And it's all been fragmented.
That's my hands down favorite work to do with people is to heal the female lineage, to work with them on doing that, because there's so much rich wisdom held in that blood, like you said, and in those messages. And there's a lot of fragmentation too. We carry centuries and centuries of oppression and pain, and but there's real liberation available from that pain and suffering, and immense wisdom and opportunity there too,
For sure. And for me, it's like I like to jump timelines in my mind in terms of, that sounds very exotic, but it's what I mean by that is I like to go backwards into time and space, and even if it's quasi fantasy related, because there's always truth in fantasy, and you'll recognize it. It'll be familiar. This is why fantasy films are so popular. But it's like going back in a time where women were not oppressed and females were venerated, and females, the serpent's wisdom that we were talking about prior to recording. It's like the nature of the divine feminine, the goddess energy connecting to these things, because it's gonna, because we have to deal with so many years of the fragmentation, it's like trying to jump that timeline back far enough to where you can maybe step into, some written material or film or even artwork that venerates the feminine, venerates the goddess, venerates these, the parts of ourselves that have been vilified, and to study them and allow them to communicate back to you through imagination and through divination and through these concepts of our Mercury and our sword, because it'll inspire a lot of thoughts. In my personal practice, I work with the goddesses and various forms of them, is all a part of trying to connect to the time and space where I firmly believe that women we were the grail. Like it is, we are the grail, but it's like we were recognized as the grail. We were recognized as the creators.
And it's so beautiful because there's so many different archetypes to connect with within the feminine. You can connect like straight back to Isis, for example, or you can connect with Mother Mary, Mary Magdalene. You can connect with Freya. You can connect with so many, right? And I love, something I think is a beautiful practice for people, and something that's really helped me is to, if you can, find any piece of your feminine lineage and trace it back just through your DNA, So for me, my mother's lineage is French and Dutch. So it's like sort of in the same area. And that land I really connect with, and in particular, the Magdalene, Mother Mary. And so that's been my feminine practice, has been more centered in with those archetypes. But you can trace that and trace it back to the female deities, and those archetypes, and what, even just some of the practices, like incorporating one practice from your heritage, can be so powerful.
And this is why the gods and the goddesses are there. This is why. This is the exact reason, is to help connect us, to remind us, to ignite within us something familiar. And I find it so fascinating when you talk about DNA and ancestry. I find it so fascinating that our blood or our spit can link us back to land, like physical land. Isn't that wild to think about? Like, I understand that it's a concentration of the same or similarities to that particular bloodline or lineage, but the fact that it's connected to a landscape is so, I don't know, but my mind just gets off on going down that. Like, I just enjoy thinking about what that means, and like how to sit with that in a way that you can find really valuable meaning in that. But exactly what you said, it's like this helps people who are new to this work connect with something to start with. It's just go in your ancestry, do some investigation of what our ancient ancestors were worshiping and venerating, and their archetypes that they were working with. And if you can do a trip to the motherland, connect with those bodies of water, because the divine feminine exists in the water, connect with the landscapes. And it's like, again, you'll begin to have a conversation.
Well, and it goes back to your point around knowledge and it being familiar, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, there's so much wisdom in what's familiar to us. And I think in so many ways here in the States, we seek to find something to anchor to. It's why there's a lot of like cultural appropriation that happens, because people are looking for roots, and looking for something that's familiar. And there's a lot of beauty. And even if you can't return to the culture where your roots are, just studying it and understanding it more, maybe learning something about the language. We're talking about air. So it's like the language, or like you said, the land, the deities, and it's going to create something that feels familiar within you. It can really activate your DNA in a way that's incredibly empowering.
I think it does. I mean, this is just me talking my theoretical like riffing, but it's like, I think that there is something connected with our blood that maybe connects then in with these landscapes or these origin stories that activates something.
Yeah.
And activates maybe something within us. And this is why it's been so actively pursued to disconnect us from these things. We think about the disconnection from landscapes. I mean, I have a client that lives in Australia, but her and I both have Irish origins. So it's like how we're in completely different continents, but yet we've got this origin story of a very small little patch of Earth here on planet Earth. Like Ireland's very small. Yeah. And it's like, it's just so wild to me how there's something very tangible about this that I think is a power. That's all I'll just say. It's a power. It's a power that they don't want people tapping into, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, belongingness is incredibly powerful. And I think in many ways, it's why there's like such a push to like break up culture, and to fragment that, because that sense of belonging, you think about like how the Scots were able to like survive as that like rich culture that they had, and finally at a certain point it kind of broke off and they, fell to the British Empire in a lot of ways. But it's like there's so much power in that warrior spirit of belonging, and understanding and familiarity. And I feel like the more we become globalized, although it's beautiful in so many ways, it's also like it's fragmenting too.
No, and this is why the work is, I think that, people are searching, and I think that that's why this type of work is so effective, because it plays on these concepts and it opens you up to the idea that you can still connect to these origins just by sitting in your room and going within yourself. Like that's a pretty woo concept, but it actually has these activations that open and awaken you to different channels that take you down certain rabbit holes that lead you to knowledge, that leads you to larger understandings of yourself and the world and your place in it. I don't know. It's just, it's very effective. And to me, this is why it was likely put underground.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you think too about like, we're talking about air, so stories and the power of story and storytelling,
I love it. And again, the act of creation, like that is that ability, that human ability to put things into a frame that helps channel it through time and space over decades and generations and generations and generations. I mean, the fact that you can look at some ancient civilizations and we can't even wrap our mind around how they were doing stuff. Like it's amazing to even think about. But you know, the stories that have lasted through time and space, the just metaphors in terms of myth, it's like all of these things, the architecture, like our ability to capture things, to try to share knowledge and push it forward to help future humans is, I mean, it's like, that's what we're here doing. So
Yeah.
try not to give that power away. Try to make sure that
Yeah.
you're staying active in creating things.
I love that. And once again, going back to discernment and protection of your crown, of your field, discerning what's coming in and how you're processing it so that it's not becoming programming and it's not pulling you out of your center, you know, because that's what this really does.
These kind of conversations help. Like, I feel like there's something very powerful with these podcast conversations that people are having with one another and also people are listening to, because it's like, it is our ability to share stories or to create something that is designed to help, you know, put forth information in a way that inspires thought and inspires different ways of thinking. Like, there is something, you know, so powerful with this particular medium that we have right now. But also, I think a lot about the vulnerability. Like, it's very fragile. Like, the fact that we're giving so much of our thoughts and language away to something that isn't tangible. So still making sure to try to write as much as possible and to put things on paper as much as possible, because, you know, it's a very vulnerable medium.
It is. I think there's so much power in the way that we've all become. I mean, you're in New Orleans, I'm in LA. We're able to see each other, communicate, share this information and our perspectives and what we've learned. But it's, yeah, I mean, there's a whole shadow side to the amount of information and data and that's out there too. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of skewing and manipulation of the truth. And it's really comes down to us and our own, you know, discernment to decide, does this resonate? Does this actually feel in truth, you know, to me? And also holding the nuance that different truths can exist at the same time, you know?
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of it. It's the only truth that matters is your truth. Like, it is inherent within us. But I definitely feel like we are much more connected than we are different. And we're going to find, you know, if everyone were to step into these practices and start to really discern who they are without the noise and without the conditioning, because shedding the conditioning is so, it's not only a painful process because it requires so much shadow work, but it's also incredibly, like, you go through, I guess, what would be considered almost a death. Like, you have to be open to dissolving a huge portion of who and what you identified as. And it's a difficult thing. And I totally get why people avoid that work and totally avoid doing it, because it's painful. It's actually very painful process.
Yes.
So it's like it's a whole thing that you have to go through in order to get to the other side and in order to see the beauty at the other side of it. But at the same time, that is where you are going to learn how to step into that authenticity and to learn to recognize what is familiar and to learn how to tap into these, what I perceive as an extrasensory ability. Like, these are gifts that everyone has the ability to step into. Everyone's is going to have a unique degree or a various shade of what those gifts are, but it's all about connecting with these divine sources, because they're going to guide us. They're going to guide us through these times that look a lot like the Dark Ages.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is with what you said, kind of related back to something I was feeling earlier too. And these messages that we get that are our truth are so often not what we want to hear, you know, and it's like very easy to sort of stay with the program. And I think that it's so destabilizing for the root to come to the realization that what you thought was happening, what you thought, the way you thought the world was working is not in fact true. And because that's so root chakra, that's so connected to our safety, like our primal security systems that we have in place, our ego, that it's it requires, like you said, that death of what was and that total dissolving of what has felt safe. But there's so much safety in truth, even though it might not correlate to our human safety,
Yeah.
it's in the end the safest place to be. It's just very uncomfortable sometimes to accept that truth.
For sure. Well, and death is coming for us all. Like it's really like
We're really in our Scorpios now.
We're slowly getting back into our Scorpio conversations. Like death is coming for us all, and the faster we can recognize that as definitive, and it's a very difficult thing because we're so disconnected from the processes of death. But the more we realize that time's a ticking, and do not waste your life on being something you're not to please others who are, other people's expectations or societies. It's like, we're all trying to really find our authentic voice and our authentic truth through this work. And I think that is the goal, and it's the goal to achieve that as soon as possible. So then you're not going through an entire lifetime of just not being connected to your inner, who you really are, and your inner truth, your inner sword, everything, just all of it. It's your authenticity. It's who you really are.
Yeah. It's so powerful. And as you said, the sword it cuts through, so it can be sharp at times, but it's
well, and it's like the nature of the weapon, because we also know that the shadow of the sword is the weaponization of it. This is the thing with all elements, is they're as equally as effective to build, they are as equally effective to destroy. Water is one of the most destructive elements. I'm dealing with that living here in the South, and our words are destructive, and fire is destructive. Anyone who lives in fire territory. And, it's all of these elements have their shadow side, and Mother Nature makes sure that we are familiar with their shadow side and how destructive they are. But at the same time, it's what's strange about the destruction of things is the beauty that grows out of them. And that's, to me, the lesson of attachment, right? How attachment is what perpetuates suffering. And if you can work on detaching from things, that is what allows the elevated state of consciousness to really step in and have an active principle in your life. But it is that nature of creation, but being willing to burn it at the same time, Burning Man style. That's that whole, the nature of that festival is to step into those powers.
Yeah.
And attachments problems. Like, I got so much water in my chart. I love holding on to things. Like, just I want to hold on to everything forever. Like, it's just such a part of my nature, and I have to exercise so much practice and discipline against that, because I love collecting things, books. I make things. It's like, it's such a pain. It's such a painful thing to think about destroying something.
Oh, it really is. I understand that intimately, and letting go is really tough for me. I have my son Mercury in the 12th house, and it's just like, it's rough, but it's like, that's what I'm here to learn, is that cycle, death and rebirth, and letting go and loss, and that things are just simply transformed. They're not lost, I think that in many ways we're so disconnected from death, and it's part of Francis Weller, someone who I really love, a teacher and a psychotherapist, talks about how we're so disconnected from death in our culture now, in our Western culture, that we are terrified of it. And it's what really drives the fear, is this fear of death, and what makes us do crazy things and makes us want to live forever. Like, I don't know about you. I have no interest in living forever. Like, I'm good,
If life was funner, like, it talks about how pleasure and fun it is here on Earth, but I don't know if it was funner, maybe, but it's pretty hard. Adulting is hard.
It's so hard. Yeah, but it's our intimacy with death is it's a key to, it's a key to really truly living, you know?
I just think that there's something beyond, and that there's, I think that once upon a time, you know, it was merely this kind of life form that we're in now was merely a bridge to get to the next thing. So I think that it was welcomed in a much different way, different relationships to it, and welcomed and more open. And also, I think that there were tools, you know, when we think about the nature of the goddess, you know, she's the creator. You know, we come into this earth through a female, so we can just all agree that she's the creator, she's God, and that what ushers us out is also a dark feminine energy. This is the difference between the light and the dark. So we have a light feminine energy that's bringing us in, and then we have a dark feminine energy that's ushering us into the underworld. And how I think that understanding maybe what we're trying to exercise about ourselves to prepare us for that trek through the underworld. It's like they had that knowledge once upon a time. Like there was so much practice going into their death, and so much preparation to the body, and so much ritual around the way that bodies were placed and how they were placed. And you see this in all types of practices, indigenous practices, like they were preparing for something. It wasn't just a death. Okay, now you're going to go into the ground because you're dead. It was, you know, we're going to make sure that you have tools with you. We're going to make sure that you have wine with you. We're going to make sure that you have your spears with you. Like there is all of this practice that we are so far removed from. So clearly they were connected to some knowledge, some knowing that we have an adventure ahead.
Yeah, there's a whole journey.
We have a whole journey ahead of us beyond this lifetime. And I don't know, hopefully it's fun.
Yeah, hopefully it's a little less rocky. Maybe that's, you know, the
Hopefully
whole
they don't
thing,
have
right?
politics in the evil empire.
Totally. Yeah, I would prefer to have a few less politicians.
Exactly. Hopefully money is not a part of the next sequence of our story, because it's literally the root of all evil.
Yeah.
But it's just, you know, opening up these ideas. And this is the nature of air, is to open up these ideas. It's just all ideas, it's all theory, it's all what ifs, the imagination. And this is the exercise of this form of who we are, is to allow those ideas to express and allow those ideas to flow, and don't allow anyone to squash them, you know, allow them to live.
I love that. It's I feel like we really like worked with air in this episode. And is there anything else you want to is there anything else you want to
I don't think so. I think maybe like to reflect, because it's been a long conversation. It's just really think about the exercise of your sword and the nature of the tool of the sword, and to learn how to step into clarifying the different parts of yourself, to begin channeling communication, and start a practice around that. And use forms of divination. Astrology is a beautiful form of divination, working with cards, pendulums. There's all types of divinatory tools that you can work with, but to start that practice, because that is the beginning of being able to channel the messages from these sentient beings that are communicating with you or trying to communicate with you.
Yeah.
And then also to think about language and words and the power of them, and to explore the root words, and to think about translations, and exercising maybe some practice around your words through writing or through even recording things. I think that there's power in that as well.
Absolutely. And we're in an election year. We are in Jupiter and Gemini. There's a lot of noise. So it's so powerful to talk about this now, and how we can harness and discern and use it to empower us, you know?
Yes. And don't be afraid to talk. Like, don't be afraid to speak your truth, even if it might ruffle some feathers. And not that I feel like people might take that to a weird extreme over the interwebs, but in terms of conversations with other people, it's like find your safe people and allow yourself that ability to just channel your thoughts and ideas and to learn how to really get it out. Because that's, I think, another difficulty with the exercise of air is to not talk nonsensically and to try to have really meaningful conversations and learn how to communicate in ways that you can get a real deep understanding of other people. You know, that passing forth of the baton. It's like, I'm going to speak, you will listen, now you're going to speak and I will listen. To think about those exchanges and to exercise as much consciousness around the act of that and how powerful. I think so many people just talk to talk, you know, and not think about what they're actually saying. Sometimes, I mean, I certainly do it. I know that, like, I think we're so used to just kind of running our mouths, but trying to do it in a way that's more thoughtful and more connected, I think is an exercise that's hopefully people, I think we would just be a lot better in terms of our relationships if we practice better communication. So,
oh my gosh, for sure. Yeah. There's so much that can get lost in that place.
It's funny because I'm teaching a tarot class right now and we're getting ready to enter into swords, and swords is literally what we're talking about, communication air. And I call it people problems. Like so much of swords energy, because if anyone's familiar with tarot cards, or at least the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, they're the very challenging suits. It's a lot of dark imagery in that, and it invokes a lot of anxiety, swords energy does. But it's just because there's so much complications when it comes to our relationships due to our inability to communicate effectively.
Yes. Yeah, there's so much confusion and suffering, like you said, as a result of that. So yeah.
Practicing how to communicate. And I'm not pretending to be an expert at it. It's all a work in progress, but just the awareness and the efforts of learning how to be clear.
Yeah. And to balance all of those bodies so that we can communicate in a clear way. That's such a huge part, is like connecting with our truth when we're in connection with someone else is the work. It's a lot of work.
The work.
Yeah.
The dissolve and the coagulates. It's constantly working on that principle, and it will help. It will help you gain much more understanding and self-control over those parts of yourself.
Thank you so much for being here. This was so fun and amazing. And
thank you. And thank you for having me. I love having our deep Scorpio conversations.
Me too. They're so great. They're so fun. Is there would you like to share how people can connect with you?
People can find me at KristenUrlacher.com, which is my website. I am on the Instagram. I do have a very small private account for my clients and for people who are interested in interacting me on the interwebs, at KU Astro Magic. And I'm currently teaching my tarot course right now. But I do have some other additional classes that I'll be introducing into the future. I'm thinking late summer. I am kind of formulating a ritual class, how to construct a ritual.
Beautiful.
And what that looks like. And the element of air is a part of ritual, invocation and prayer. It's using your words to evoke your will. So,
yeah, that'll be so beneficial.
Thank you.
We need it. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, yeah, I highly recommend following Kristen. She is, you're just a well of knowledge and have so much wisdom to share, and you're not afraid to go down a rabbit hole, and I love that so much, and it's so helpful because
I'm a little noisy. I do have to control myself, especially with Jupiter and Gemini right now. I'm like, you're being a little excessive.
It's a whole thing. I feel that I'm like constantly writing things out and then like deleting them because I'm like, this really doesn't need to be shared, but editing. Yes.
You've got that beautiful Venus in Virgo too. So you're a good editor. See, I don't I'm lacking some of that earth. So I'm like, just blah. Just putting it out there, a little excessive.
Yeah, well, it's I don't feel that at all, but thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom. And I'm excited to
explore the next elements.
That's right. Yep. We see each other again.
All right. Thank you,
All
Ali.
right. Take care. Everyone.